I'm very excited to be meeting Justin Packshaw today. He's an adventurer, an explorer, as well as a very successful businessman. I've had the pleasure of looking after Justin for the last 15 years, and I see him generally before he goes on his trips abroad to very dangerous places doing very crazy things. My name's Dr. Garry Savin, and I'm the medical director at Lumen at 17 Harley Street, where we perform advanced health assessments.
My background, I started as a soldier and I was in the British Army for 10 years where I had a fantastic time. And during that time, I also sailed for Britain. So I grew up in the Mediterranean and was lucky to sort of sail before I could almost walk. And I sailed for Britain in a race called the Whitbread, which is a race around the world. And that started me on a sort of course of being out, really loving the outdoors. And I've sort of carried that all the way through to my 57 years. And then I started, I was always really fascinated by old school explorers. And it's mad to think that, you know, just over 100 years ago, no one had been to the North Pole, the South Pole, top of Everest. And I've sort of been lucky enough to replicate some of those trips. And pre all my trips, I've come and seen you, actually, Garry, as you well know, to give me a proper MOT. And this last one was really quite punchy, though. And the aim was, I mean, my trips in the past have been around philanthropy and trying to raise money for good causes, and I've taken wounded soldiers off and stuff. I first went to the high Arctic 30 years ago, and on my last trip, I noticed the difference, which is quite frightening, really, if you, with regards to climate change and what's happening to the world. So I thought I'd start looking at doing trips around science and research and bringing in some really big kind of proper power players. And on this one, the aim was to do a full crossing of Antarctica. And we got NASA, the European Space Agency, Stanford University and the University of Central Florida involved, and you guys. And with the idea about doing two sets of research, one around the environment, what's happening with Antarctica, and then one around our physiology and psychology.
Can I ask where the space involvement came? Because two of those agencies are space agencies.
Yeah, well, if you think that the next frontier for all of us, really, is space. I mean, we're, you know, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, they've already sort of, that envelope is open. And whereas before, anyone who went into space was a professional. They were either sort of test pilots or they were people who were specialized at understanding the risk and everything. Now, you and I can go. And so it's opened up to sort of Joe Public, really. And what that actually means is that you have to look at how that's going to impact on people's bodies and also mentally. I mean, if you're going to go to Mars, you're going to sit in a tin can for 3 months.
Yeah,
so
not move.
So psychologically, what is that going to do? So when you look at how you test that, there are very few places where you can do that effectively. And Antarctica happens to be one of them. It's all white. There's no context there, so there's no color, the operating environment is brutal. And so as Petri dishes go, it's a pretty good one. And so throw in humans, and there's masses of dissecting you can do on data, as you know, on this particular trip.
So what sort of things were being measured? What did you have to do on the trip to get the data that they were after?
So from a physiological perspective, we had lots of smart technology on us. So Garmin basically had us wired, so everything from heart rate, sleep levels, stress levels, etc., etc.
Okay.
So all of that, and then we gave blood, pee, poo, and saliva once a week, and so the combination of all of that. In fact, we did that for a year, and I think we stopped about 3 weeks ago. I think I'm right in saying we're the most highly tested individuals. My partner and I, the guy I did it with, who's called Jamie Facer-Childs, who is a doctor as well.
Yes.
I think we're the most highly tested individuals on the planet. And when all of that data is dissected and they look at stress levels around we were kite skiing.
So can I just get this right? This trip was unsupported, which means it was just two of you on your own in the wilderness with no backup team there. So obviously very dangerous, very cold temperatures. If anything went wrong and you were being pulled at presumably speed by a huge kite, then were you not a bit worried that something could happen?
Well, I think with all these things, I mean, it was an old school adventure in that it was audacious in objective and it was long in duration. To answer your question, worried, I mean, look, I'm an ex-soldier, Jamie's an ex-soldier. You do a lot of background into your high-risk assessments about, what's going to happen if you break a leg or Kiting is a funny thing. Because we were unsupported, our sledges weighed about 220 kilos when we started.
Wow.
Each. So they were super heavy. And we had to start right at the beginning of the season. And inevitably, it's very windy down there. Obviously, it's very cold. The average temperature over 59 days was minus 34.
Minus 34?
Yeah. So if you think your freezer is minus 14, the coldest, so we kite for between 7 and 9 hours a day. And at the end of one day, we stopped, we checked our measurements, and we've been kiting in minus 62.
Minus 62?
Yeah. And it's almost as if you have a knife in front of you. If you had a saber, you just get blocks of ice just...
Wow.
Yeah, insane.
Wow.
I mean, really insane.
So presumably every part of your body would have to be covered.
Oh, completely covered.
Because if you took a glove off for a few minutes,
and the trouble with so I've done 7 trips to the high Arctic and to Antarctica, and I've normally man-hauled. And man-hauling is different because you obviously generate heat because you're pulling.
This is pulling a sledge.
You're pulling a sledge.
Yeah.
Kiting is very different because obviously we wanted it to be a sustainable trip. So we used the wind, which carried up, our pulse were 220 kilos when we started each because we were unsupported. We always had to, because it's very windy there, we always had to have a bigger kite than you would normally have if you were just by yourself because you're dragging all that weight. So they're quite unruly. But you're not really doing very much exercise. So once you start going, you'll kind of, the terrain's not even. So but you're not generating much heat. So keeping body heat is actually very difficult.
How do you physically train for a trip like this? What do you do to get into shape? Because obviously I've been looking after you for all of these trips and examining you before the trips, and you happen to hold the record still for the best score on the body composition analyzer that we've ever had, even though you were the first client of Lumen. But you still hold the record. So what do you actually do to get in shape for a trip where you're going to be kite surfing 8 hours a day?
I think, well, what's interesting about this trip is Jamie, my partner in crime, was 34 or is 34.
Yeah.
I'm in my late 50s. And what you really need to be is robust because it's just relentless. And it's hard graft, and you get
mentally robust.
Well, no, mentally obviously, but physically really, because you're being bashed about a lot. So the key is to get your core very strong. You've just got to be strong, really, but you also have to be quite fluid and flexible. And so, I mean, you've seen me train for 15 years, really. As I've got older, I train in a different way in that I don't want to hurt myself, so I'm not quite so brutal. But ultimately, it's always going to be the same thing, which is you just need to be very disciplined and put a lot of hours in.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really a big advocate for dragging tyres, which is a very good way of getting your core strong.
Presumably in a field, not around the local...
well, I do it. I live in northwest London, and there's a fantastic place called the Welsh Harp up there, which I drag. So I drag every day, and I'll do between 5 and 9 Ks.
Right.
With a heavy tyre, and then lots of pull-ups, lots of push-ups, that kind of stuff.
So how much of a trip like this do you think is psychological and mental resilience versus physical strength?
That's a great question. I think everything has to be driven, if you're doing something from an endurance perspective, on mental agility and mental flexibility. because there's nothing really very nice about it. It wasn't a pleasant trip at all from the moment we started.
Right.
I mean, Mother Nature is an extraordinarily powerful advocate to take on, adversary really. And so you have to have some kind of mental ebullience which allows you to kind of push through situations which aren't great. But if you physically can't keep up with what you're doing, then obviously that's going to... And the tricky thing with this last trip, because we were going right through the middle of Antarctica, if something went wrong, if one of us broke a leg or, heaven forbid, something worse, you can't just pick up your sat phone and say, you know, get me out of here.
Get me a helicopter.
I mean, Antarctica is 1.5 times the size of North America. So if something went wrong, we really were, you're kind of in trouble. And it could take anything up to 3 weeks for someone to get in. And inevitably, obviously it's a plane would have to come in. And the reason it would take so long is they have to put fuel caches down and sort of do it systematically. I mean, I've spent a bit of time in Antarctica. I've never seen terrain like it. And because there's a prevailing wind that just keeps coming down, the ice it's not kind of ice that it's like tungsten. It's like the hardest steel you can imagine. Right. Yeah. And you have these huge sort of, they're called sastrugi. It's like if you looked at a sea on a very windy day and you just froze it. The sort of, the white horses, you've got that kind of, and I just don't, for a big chunk of the trip, I just don't think a plane would have been able to land.
No,
so,
do they have crevasses and things like that?
You have crevasses going up, obviously. So Antarctica is on top of Antarctica sits an ice cube, which is, when you get onto the plateau.
Well, it's about 10,000 feet of altitude.
12.
I mean, that's amazing. Most people don't realise that, but before you even start, you're already, at the height of...
And also what other people don't realise...
Cusco in Peru.
Is 90% of the world's fresh water is in that ice cube. So the keeping that in check for the world's ecosystem, for our globe's ecosystem, is vital. Another fascinating stat about Antarctica, on the plateau there isn't a living entity. So there's no virus, there's no bacteria. It is absolutely pristine.
And so do you have to take everything with you when you leave? I mean everything, and I mean everything.
Everything.
Right.
So all our fuel, all our food.
Yes.
As I said, I mean, we started, our pulse were 228 kilos each. So if I'm 85 kilos. I mean, if I put 200 and just said drag it for 5 feet, you'd go, this is pretty difficult.
Yes. Well, the other amazing thing is I remember the first day you flew back into London, I got a phone call from you saying, I've just arrived back. Can I come and see you? I've smashed my shoulder. And you came in to see me. And basically, was it day 15 that you fell over?
The kiting is a fantastic sport, kiting. It's an amazing way to move around there. However, when you've got a lot of weight behind you, so you're being pulled from behind and you've got a kite coming up this way, which inevitably is bigger than you would normally use, as I said. They're fine when you keep them in the right power zone, but if they get out of that power zone, they can become really unruly beasts. One morning I went off and it was very breezy and we shouldn't really have kited, I don't think. But we thought we'd give it a go, and I got picked up and my pulk and then I got slammed down. The pulk pulled me back and I got slammed down on my shoulder.
Did you know you'd broken something straight away?
I knew I'd really hurt it, yeah.
Right.
I mean, I dislocated, and
so you had to carry on for another 40 plus days after that with a broken shoulder, being pulled along by a kite in the middle of nowhere with 220 kilos on a sledge. That's pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's funny. There's you get into quite a strange mindset really when you do these things, and you kind of appreciate that there's just not very much you can do. So we could have thrown the towel in and said, okay, that's it, it's a game, which we knew could happen. I mean, we broke kit all the time, and breaking yourself, I suppose, at some level was going to happen. And I knew I'd hurt myself. And obviously, Jamie, the guy I was doing it with, is a doctor, and he knew as well.
Yeah.
In fact, his diagnosis was exactly what, because I came in and said, Jamie said, I had an MRI on it, and you said that's exactly what has happened, apart from the fractured clavicle.
So I can see why the space agencies were monitoring you, because it's to see how a human would survive in such a difficult environment, a remote environment, and how you cope with adversity.
Well, I've done this for a long time. I've seen people do remarkable things. And, we must never forget that, humans are meant to excel, and we sort of touch the surface of what we can do. And I think with my past, I cut my cloth really in the army, and then sailing, and you can always go further than you think you can. And it doesn't matter what age you are. You have to be respectful. You have to, and I think that sort of loops back for me to you and what you do here at Lumen, because before I start all of these trips, I'll come and see you, and I spend a full day here, and you test every single aspect of me. So I have a proper MOT. And so when I start, I know that you've given me a green tick saying you're in good shape, or watch this, or what. And the older I get, the more I appreciate how vitally important that is to do. And 15 years. I think that's one of the marvels about where we are in society now. You can come to places like this, and you can have a proper look at what's going on inside you, whereas before no one could do that. It's fascinating. It's brilliant.
The technology now that we've got with the scan technology,
amazing.
We can see down to 3 millimeters. So if there was, God forbid, a cancer or something like this, we've got the best chance of finding it early. I remember the first time I think we met, you were going to climb Everest, and I think you were one of the few people in that expedition that actually summited. And I remember you were in fantastic shape, and you did brilliantly in all the tests, and we knew there was no physical problems. And then I remember you texting me from Camp 4 and saying, we're just going to summit now. I'm just looking out the tent at the summit, and we're just leaving to go for the summit. And I thought, wow, that's incredible that I'm sitting in an office in London, and you're off halfway up Everest, about to. The next 18 hours is pretty critical whether you're going to get back or not. Because 1 in 10 people that try and climb that mountain don't come back.
Well, I think that stat's actually got a bit bigger. We were a team of 10, 4 of us summited. And it was a very poignant trip for me, that. And I remember sending you that message. And when my dad, he got very badly bust up in a car crash, and 8 years before I went to Everest, and he was in a very bad way, and he was in hospital. And when I got to the summit, first I tried to phone Tamsin, my wife, and
is there reception up there?
There was on my sat phone, and she was engaged. And eventually I got hold of my brother, who lives in Australia, one of my brothers, and I phoned him. I said, phone my dad, phone our dad, and say I'm here. And he did, and 10 minutes later my dad died.
What?
So it was very, and it's not a sad story. He was in a very bad way, but he kind of hung in there for me to get to the top. And it was very lovely in a funny way, because you're so high there. As you know, there's lots of dead bodies on Everest, and you kind of feel that it's going to be very sad to witness that. And it's a very selfish. All of these things are quite selfish to do. I've got young. Then I had very young children. Again, I'm a huge advocate that you have to live your life on the terms that you want to live your life. And I talk about this all the time to big businesses, to schools. And you must be responsible. You must be thoughtful. You must have lots of empathy. You must be safe. So you must prepare, you must do all these things. And if Tamsin was here and you asked her the question about me doing these trips, she would say to you, I don't really like it, no, but I trust him. The aspect of trust is, I've done many things where it just hasn't felt right, or the weather's been wrong or something, and I've said to my team, right, guys, we're coming off. We're not going to do this.
Yeah.
And Everest is a very good example of that.
So some people would say that it's unfathomable that you're putting yourself in risky situations when you've got a young family and a wife, and is that a responsible thing to do? So I'm really interested in what it is that drives you to push yourself and put yourself in these dangerous environments. Why do you think you do it?
I've thought a lot about this. I think it started in that I'm the youngest of four. I've got two older brothers and an older sister. We, as I said, grew up in Malta. We were big sailors and quite sporty. So I've always tried to kind of keep up or be better than I should have been, I suppose, for my age. And that, coupled with the fact that when I was young, I was absolutely fascinated by old school explorers. The
Shackleton.
Ernest Shackleton, Mallory on Everest, the people who said, I was a big sailor, so Francis Chichester and, Amundsen. And I was sort of amazed that, my grandmother was born in 1907, and she died at 102 when my daughter was 2, and they were born on the same day. And so she, in one generation, she had lived through all of this. She
all the explorers.
All the explorers, the Wright brothers, and I just sort of the context of it wasn't very long ago that people had done this. 1909 for the North Pole.
So Justin, on the trip originally it was scheduled for about 80 days, but I understand that you managed to get there in 57 days. But I think you had some problems with the weather, didn't you?
Yeah. So as with all good plans, I mean, originally we wanted to go to a place in Antarctica called the Pole of Inaccessibility.
The Pole of the?
Pole of Inaccessibility.
That sounds like somewhere out of...
It sounds like someplace in Mordor.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the Pole of Inaccessibility is the middle of the landmass of Antarctica.
I'm going to check this. If you're making it up...
No, I'm not. I really am not. So it's the middle of the landmass, so the furthest part from all areas of sea.
Okay, so it's not really the South Pole.
No, the South Pole is not at the bottom of Antarctica. It's the bottom of the world, but Antarctica's skewed, so it's actually on one side.
Okay, yeah.
So what I originally wanted to do was go to the Pole of Inaccessibility and then to the South Pole, which adds about another 450 nautical miles.
Wow.
And when we started, we man-hauled up onto the plateau, which is sort of fine. You can man-haul in pretty much any weather. You just hunker down and off you go. And it was brutally cold when we started because we were starting very early towards the end of the Antarctic winter.
Can you do anything to train for this weather? Do you sit in a deep freeze in a supermarket for a weekend or anything like that? Or would you just go straight into it?
Just get into it slowly.
Right.
But you have to be a bit careful when you arrive, a few days. And when we got quite close to the plateau, the weather really started becoming extremely nasty. And we lost about 10 days. I mean,
There's nowhere to hide either, is it? It's
no,
just
well, there's nowhere to hide for sure. And you were in you don't take a special tent. I mean, it is a special tent, but it's still
a tent.
It's just two pieces of nylon. You have an outer layer and an inner layer of super thin nylon. And for about 6 days, we had winds of about 130 miles an hour.
Wow.
Just blasting over us, and you
can't move, can you?
You cannot move. I mean, one day the wind thankfully tends to come from the same area, and tents are made that the aluminium poles that they have are very good in a certain direction. So you always put the nose of the tent into the wind, and the wind sort of rolls over it. And the wind veered round, and so our poles were being completely flattened. Mm-hmm. But it was probably about 120 miles an hour.
Did you ever think you were going to lose the tent?
Well, we would definitely lose the tent. So we had to say, right, we need to move the tent. Okay. We're going to have to shift the tent round.
Get out in the
So
wind.
we had our ice axes, and we basically put our ice axes in. We had a strop on them. and we'd have to lie flat on the ground, otherwise you just go. And so, but we lost 10 days, and 10 days sitting in a tent when you are unsupported is a pain, because you are using fuel and food which you need for your trip. So when we hit day 10, I made the call of, once you really get into the interior, you're on your own. And if we were going to go up to the, I just didn't want to suddenly find that we were 3 weeks out and we had no fuel, because it was important. You have a start and you have a finish, and you want to finish, and we wanted to finish at the south.
It's all carefully worked out. I imagine how many calories you're going to eat, everything to the gram.
Scientific. We had our diet.
How many calories were you burning a day?
I reckon we burned about 8,500.
Wow.
Yeah, but and still
the average
lost.
person would be about 2,500.
And we still lost. I lost 9 kilos when I came back.
Yeah, I remember we checked you when you came back. You're very lean.
And I think my body fat was down to tiny,
so 2
or 3%. So yeah, it's all very carefully worked out. But also with all these things, you have to factor in a margin of error.
Yes.
One.
Yes.
A margin of change and adaptability.
What's your next trip then?
So the next one, I'm going to try and kite surf across the Atlantic.
Across the Atlantic.
Which, with a mate of mine called Charlie Pitcher, and we're building this amazing hydrofoil, and we're going to, again, around sustainability, and that will be around plastics in the ocean. And
what's the hydrofoil made of?
So it's made of recycled plastic bottles that have come out of the ocean.
Really? Wow.
And it's super fast. We're testing at the moment. And then the third one is, I'm going to, with a team of about 10 of us, we're going to do a full crossing of the Empty Quarter, which is the desert that runs basically all the way from southern Oman, but then it goes into Saudi Arabia all the way to the top, which is 1,000 miles.
Is that on foot?
We're going to do it on bikes. We're going to do it on e-bikes. And the whole trip, from our support team and everything, will be sustainably driven around the sun. So everything. So to charge a car off the sun is very difficult.
Yes.
And so that's what we're looking at, and it's again an amazing project.
So you'll be charging the bikes, will you?
Everything. We'll be charging everything that we use. So it's 1,000 miles. So it's a big journey, and that's the other great thing. I mean, you do this stuff long enough, and you end up getting the very best. On the last trip, it doesn't really get better than NASA and the European Space Agency, Stanford University, NASA. Amazing, So yeah, we've got some amazing partners, and you guys. I mean, in my eyes, the most important thing is my chassis pulling me around. And for 15 years, Garry, I've been coming here because I feel that you guys are the very best at this.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, it's been an amazing experience chatting with you and hearing a little bit about some of your crazy adventures. And I hope it's inspired some people to think about pushing the envelope.
Yeah, which we must all do. And thank you. Thanks for keeping me in good nick.
Pleasure.